My name is Robert Forbes, and I am a historian. I currently teach at Southern Connecticut State University in New Haven, Connecticut.
Excellent. Thank you for joining us. And today we'll be talking about your editorship, I believe, of Thomas Jefferson's Notes on the State of Virginia, which is right here, and a paper you wrote called Secular Damnation, Thomas Jefferson and the Imperative of Race. So maybe you could begin by explaining the project you did with notes and what the notes on the state of Virginia were and why they're kind of noteworthy.
Sure. Maybe the best way to begin, since I spent a lot of time trying to perfect it, is to give the introductory paragraph of my book. What I say there is Notes on the State of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson's only published book and longest sustained text, is almost universally regarded as one of the most important American books published before 1800. It's also among the least understood. A paradox ever since its publication, Notes includes passages of lucid scientific thought along with examples of shockingly flawed reasoning. It contains Jefferson's most passionate indictments of slavery and his most blatant expressions of racism. It incorporates stirring invocations of justice and callous endorsements of appalling judicial cruelty. It wavers between the lofty universalism of the great statesman and philosophe and the crass parochialism of the Virginia planter. A towering achievement of the American Enlightenment, Notes outlines one of the first proposals for a system of universal public education and proclaims a path-breaking defense of freedom of conscience and religion. At the same time, it presents the earliest plan for the removal and colonization of Black Americans and the earliest assertion that their emancipation would be impossible unless they were so removed. So that's sort of how I begin the book. Let's see here. You asked where the book came from. It came out of a questionnaire that the minister to the French government in the French embassy in Philadelphia circulated to, actually the secretary of the minister, circulated to all 13 states. And Jefferson eventually got the one for Virginia. He had a set of 22 questions. Jefferson sort of took this and realized it was an extraordinary opportunity to sort of put out there his views of Virginia and more broadly of America. The second longest one that we know of, not all of the responses have survived, but the one from Connecticut did. It was written by Roger Sherman, then our governor, and it was 4 handwritten pages. Jefferson's was, we can tell from his description of how it expanded, probably about 30 handwriting. He writes sort of 3 pages for every page of printed text. Usually the ratio is the opposite. So this shows a mammoth text document sort of welled up from him. And he wrote it while he was, he began it while he was governor of Virginia. In fact, he began it while the state of Virginia was under invasion by the British. he wanted to quit being governor, wrote a letter to his friend John Page, who had come in a close second in the race, and begged him to take the job. And he said, "No, you have projects you want to do, but you have to stay with it to the end of your term." It was also the period when his wife had the last of their 7 born children, and she was always very sick after giving birth. This time she never recovered, and he mailed out the copy to the report to Marbois in December, and she died the next September. He spent all of that time, or a great deal of that time, working on his revisions. That her death almost killed him. His daughter was worried that he would lose his mind, and I think part of the reason for this, that clearly he cared very deeply about his wife, but it also meant, her dying also meant that he had really nothing to perpetuate his name. His experience during as governor during the Revolution was a catastrophe, and he had actually been called up by the legislature to defend himself against a series of charges, and he had no son to carry his name, and no possibility of another son. He didn't believe in a system of an immaterial soul that persisted. So he sort of had the Greek and Roman view that the only form of immortality is fame, and the only thing that he was famous for, or could be famous for, he wasn't at the time, was his authorship of the Declaration of Independence. He had let this be known to a few people, particularly in Virginia, but really nobody particularly cared. And there was a state paper issued by the Continental Congress, and people don't generally sort of trouble themselves about who actually did the drafting. I like to ask audiences if they can tell me who wrote the Constitution, and they generally will say James Madison, but that's not who wrote it. It was a delegate from New York named Governor Morris, and we don't celebrate Governor Morris. We don't. His house is not a UNESCO World Heritage Site. So the process of Jefferson becoming that famous for that particular accomplishment really has a huge amount to do with Jefferson. But of course, there's a big problem with the Declaration of Independence, with being the author of the Declaration of Independence, if you are the owner of over 200 slaves. How are you going to square those two parts of your identity without going down as history's greatest monument to hypocrisy?
when I think that that's one of the, I want to get to that in a minute, but could you kind of lead us through the notes as they stand today and kind of what he was trying to do in them and what he may have accomplished? Because I think the contradictions that you mentioned are many, and we could probably spend a lot of time on them, but and we'll get to the biggest one, which is the slavery issue in a minute, but kind of like give us an overview of what the notes are in content, basically.
Yeah. It might be helpful to put on screen the title page. He starts it with the he puts an introduction, a preface, advertisements is what they called it at the time. Notes on the State of Virginia, written in the year 1781, somewhat corrected and enlarged in the winter of 1782, for the use of a foreigner of distinction in answer to certain queries proposed by him respecting, and he goes through the queries, which I sort of see as chapters. He lays out the boundaries of the state. He elucidates its rivers. This is interesting because he not only talks about what we would think of as the rivers of Virginia, but every river that connects to any other river from Virginia and follows them all the way to their to the end of their course, in some cases all the way to Mexico. So here is one place where Virginia sort of expands to fill the entire continent. Talks about seaports, mountains, cascades and caverns. The longest chapter in the book is the ones on minerals, vegetables, and animals. That's almost a third of the entire book. And he lays out a lot of information that is sort of typical of the natural histories of the 18th century, and goes on many discursive sidetracks, none of which I think are, he calls it notes on the state of Virginia, and constantly belittles this thing. It's a poor crayon, it's worthless. But he worked on it not until 1782, as he puts on the title page here, but it published it in 1785. He worked on it for longer than any other thing in his life besides Monticello. Every word is exactly what he wanted it to be. So it operates on several levels, only one of which is this report to Monsieur Maubois.
And some of if I understood, this made him fairly influential as well, correct? This publication?
Yeah, it was, it came out before the Constitutional Convention, when people had no clear idea of what the United States was. It was a sort of an empty space for him to put this incredibly dense and detailed vision before initially the European public, but also the American public. And before it was even published, before he did an initial run of 200 copies in Paris, and then published it in England in 1787. But before that came out, before he was back in the United States, he had received honorary degrees at Harvard, Yale, and what became Brown. he was a member of the American Philosophical Society. He was a significant figure. You really could say that he was lauded as the most learned and philosophical American after Franklin. And you'll remember in the musical Hamilton, he comes back and there's already a letter, Senate approved, for him to be in Washington's cabinet. So he went from a failed governor to a major player in the new United States. And the major thing that made that happen, it wasn't his great treatise improving the opportunities for the whaling industry. It was Notes on the State of Virginia. That was his greatest accomplishment when he was there.
That's interesting. And I think getting into kind of the what he did with race and how he, because in your paper, Secular Damnation, there's a very interesting argument being made. And I think that it was very enlightening to me, and I found it incredibly exciting because you put him in context of what the racial thought was at the moment he was writing Notes and how he changes it.
Yes.
And right. And it's mainly to accomplish a singular goal.
Right.
Yeah. So maybe if we could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I should probably say something about why I came to do this project, which I put over 10 years into. I was not a Jefferson scholar. I was working on, many years ago, when I was a junior at George Washington, I woke up one morning and I said, I'm going to do a junior seminar on racial attitudes of the British abolitionists. And that semester paper took me 1.5 years to write. And the reason it took me so long was it took me 1 year to accept the data that I was seeing, that the British abolitionists didn't have racial attitudes. They were not operating within a paradigm of race. And that sounds crazy. And all of the secondary literature operated under the assumption or the conviction that they did think in terms of race, that everyone did. But that was not what was, what they didn't have any questions and found little interest at all in the comparative abilities of blacks and whites. Their concern was, these folks were largely evangelical Christians. Their concern was for the safety of Great Britain from God's vengeance because of the outrage, the blasphemous outrage of the slave trade, which Britain was the leading participant in. They, through the Bible, they knew that all humans were the descendants of a single pair of parents, Adam and Eve. And Paul says God is made of one blood, all nations of the earth. That was all baked in as far as they were concerned. And as far as most people were concerned, even people who were not particularly religious, because the scriptures were an authoritative work both of revealed religion, but also of history. It's just, if you want to know what happened, that's where you look. So when I would talk to audiences about this, almost every time, and understandably, someone would say, well, what about Thomas Jefferson? What about these horrible things that he said about Black people? And if you look at Chief Justice Taney's decision in the Dred Scott case, he argues that everybody at the time of the founders believed that no Blacks had any rights, which any white person was bound to respect, and that they could enslave them for their benefit, which is something that I learned that Taney himself knew far better than that, and had actually defended opponents of slavery, and had freed all of his own slaves. So there's something very strange going on there. And it seems to stem from the language about Blacks in Query 14 of Notes on the State of Virginia, which Winthrop D. Jordan, in his compilation of Anglo-American views of Blacks, of the Africans, concludes is the strongest statement, the most extreme statement of Black inferiority published for more than 30 years. So I realized I couldn't go around Jefferson. I really had to tackle Jefferson head on. And that meant knowing everything there was to know about the content and the context of Notes on the State of Virginia.
Yeah, and in the paper, you call what he does in the notes the Jeffersonian turn. And
yeah,
you could talk a little bit about how he begins to racialize this problem of slavery.
Yeah. So if all men are created equal, and both Virginia and Jefferson's personal fortunes are inextricably tied to slavery, how do you square those two things? And what Jefferson came up with was, in its own way, as sweeping and as brilliant as Hamilton's envisioning of the financial system for the United States. Jefferson sort of brought into the world, almost fully formed, the rules of racism, crystallized that. There's a precedent, there's a source for a lot of Jefferson's most extreme statements about Blacks. And that is a defense of a history of Jamaica that was written by a Jamaican planter named Edward Long in 1774. 3-volume work, most of it, well, in fact, interestingly, quite similar in conception and execution to Notes on the State of Virginia. It looks at all of the aspects of the island and the problems facing it, and proposes exhaustive solutions. But in the center of it is a chapter on Africans. And it's like a cesspool of every hideous thing that you could either find or imagine about Africans. There's no attempt at consistency in the arguments. It's sort of just a gumbo of racist ideas. And everybody understands when this comes out that it is a direct response to the 1772 decision of Lord Mansfield in the Somerset case, which concluded that slavery was not protected in England by positive law. So this young man, James Somerset, could not be taken back to Jamaica. The implications of that decision were that slavery threatened throughout the British Empire, and the West Indies in particular were very terrified that it was. So everybody understood when this book came out that the same guy had already written an attack on the Mansfield decision, that it was the self-interested argument of someone whose life depended on slavery. That was not going to work for Jefferson. But the interesting thing was the key change that Jefferson made. Long spent a lot of time trying to argue the closeness of Africans to what he called orangutans. In fact, what he meant was chimpanzees. There was a mistaken idea that all of these animals were orangutans. That Long sort of argued that orangutans were an intermediate, or that Africans were an intermediate race, intermediate species, very important term, between humans and orangutans. Well, Jefferson changed the language and described them as a race. And he sort of gives the framework of a lot of notes, not just this chapter, is that there are three races in America: the whites, the red race, the Indians, and the blacks. And that sounds like that's just a description of race, right? But that wasn't the way the term was used then. Long is trying to make this case that there are separate species, but that falls apart. Everybody understands, because there are people who can have children who are the children of blacks and whites, including a whole lot of these people on the mountaintop at Monticello. The way that Noah Webster defines race in his great dictionary of 1828 is the lineage of a family or continued series of descendants from a parent who is called the stock. A race is the series of descendants indefinitely. Thus, all mankind are called the race of Adam. The Israelites are of the race of Abraham and Jacob. Thus, we speak of a race of kings, the race of Clovis or Charlemagne, a race of nobles, etc. Jefferson gives us the modern definition, the modern terminology of race, and separates the whites, who he refers to throughout the notes on the state of Virginia, with the first person plural pronoun we, right? So the reader is drawn into this we, and the Africans, the blacks, are they. Everywhere he goes, in this book, he is he's dividing from the boundaries of Virginia to, most importantly, the boundaries between blacks and whites, which he personally knows as well as anyone are imaginary. There is no line there. But he really brings about the idea that there is a fundamental line, and writes as if this was something that had always been known. Right? So that, because of the impact of Notes on the State of Virginia, in the intelligentsia of Europe and the educated circles in the United States, particularly we're talking in the North, this becomes, and especially when he becomes the leader of one of two political parties in this, for him, existential struggle over the future of the Republic. This becomes an article of faith among Jeffersonians, and actually among lots and lots of Federalists as well. Nobody had suggested before Jefferson that after emancipation, the freed people would have to be removed from the country. And after this book, there are very few people, even opponents of slavery, who are not making that case, who don't believe that colonization of the blacks elsewhere is inevitable, is necessary. It's one of the reasons why I'm so pleased to be speaking with you here, is because I would say that that 1785 is one of these watershed years, just as 1619 and 1776, in the progress of white supremacy and race.
Yeah, one of the things that really stood out in this rhetorical move that he does is the distancing or changing the victims of slavery. So
Right.
the victim is not the African, it is the slaveholder. And then the idea that because of that, that's why the freed slave has to be removed.
Yeah.
And that stigmatization, as you say in the paper, it shifts the victims of slavery. And that, to me, that's the foundation of the white supremacist moment, because that's where you go, wait a minute, what's going on here? How are the, right, you understand where I'm going with that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and you know, it has a corrupting influence on whites. In the original version, you know, I worked on this text with the manuscript, the handwritten manuscript that went to the printer, and I was able to restore about 6,300 words that he had excised into the footnotes, so that you can sort of follow his changes. But he was talking about the odious peculiarities that we have because we were raised in slavery, and he changes that to one who was raised in slavery has these odious peculiarities in the text. But it's interesting, and it's crucial that the real problem to the whites is when they have to share a society, a government with free blacks. that's when the mixture is so devastating. You wouldn't survive long in slaveholding society if you were arguing that intermixture with slaves was destructive, because that was so pervasive everywhere.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I keep coming up against every time in these arguments, which is the turning to the other what they themselves are doing. So accusing the African slave of, raping white women and all this kind of stuff, when in fact it was the slave owner who was doing that every night to the slave. And they're telling on themselves in this kind of, and to me, that's what is so amazing about this book and your exploration of it, because it really does kind of pinpoint when this begins. And
exactly.
How
I keep asking all of my colleagues to show me an example of this kind of rhetoric before 1785. And they usually respond, well, look at Tawney's decision in Dred Scott. Well, no, that's not an example. That's somebody almost 100 years later just making that case. There's a famous passage here that is really quite shocking. He is explaining the differences in race between blacks and whites, and the superiority of the beauty of whites, and the ability of whites to blush, to show their emotions, instead of that eternal monotony which reigns in the countenances, that immovable veil of black which covers all the emotions of the other race. And then he says, add to these a flowing hair, a more elegant symmetry of form, their own judgment in favor of the whites, declared by their preference of them as uniformly as the preference of the orangutan for the black woman of his own, over those of his own species. We owe it to Fawn Brodie, her 1970s biography, sort of psychobiography of Thomas Jefferson. She picks up a letter from Jefferson to Maria Causeway, who he has a romance with, a flirtation with, and he describes himself as a perfect orangutan. He can't stand the cold climate of Paris. He's a perfect orangutan. He loves the heat of the jungle. Mm-hmm. So here's another example of putting onto someone else the emotions that you yourself are feeling.
Exactly. Yeah, and I mean, I think and again, I just kind of wanted to bring it back to the Declaration of Independence, which if we hadn't begun it with all men are created equal, right, then would we even be discussing this? Because you have to square that circle, and you have to make sure that slaves are men, but not men, and the whole.
That's an excellent and troubling question.
Right.
Or if it had been written by someone from the North who didn't have to make that, who didn't have to square that circle. But I really think that Jefferson almost never mentions the Declaration of Independence in Notes on the State of Virginia. There's one reference to it in lowercase letters, the Declaration of Independency. after that, there have been no conflicts between the states, among the 13 states. But even though he doesn't mention it, I feel its presence in almost every passage of this work, because it's not just query 14, that attacks on blacks, or query 18, which is a very eloquent attack on slavery itself. There are contributions to this in almost every query on every chapter. He's doing it in subtle ways, but it comes out. For instance, okay, we have the problem of if you're delineating blacks from whites, what do we do with albinos? What do we do with blacks who are albinos? Well, we have a discussion about albinos, talking about the sickly form of their white color, which has nothing to do with our color, and he places it in the chapter on animals. Finishes the chapter afterwards with a discussion of bees. That is part of this intricate tapestry that he is weaving. It's all through the book, and it is really pulling the concept of race into the Enlightenment, of which this is an important text. And the most damning, to go back to the idea of secular damnation, the most damning example of this is when he's, instead of the sort of bouillabaisse of racism of Edward Long, he has it's equally irrational, but it has to be, because otherwise it won't work. If you pin things down in racism, the whole concept falls apart. It has to be fluid and constantly adaptable. But he does apply an Enlightenment frame. He talks about the qualities of blacks in under the heads of memory, imagination, and reason. In memory, they are perhaps better than us, stronger than us. In imagination, they come up short. But the key issue here is reason. The key question is reason, and he makes a strong and utterly ridiculous argument for the lack of reason of blacks. And that's a big deal, because if you look up the word philosoph in Diderot's encyclopedia, the definition, or part of the definition, is reason is to the philosopher what grace is to the Christian. And we see where that goes in the French Revolution. But that, if you're saying that blacks are devoid of reason, you are in essence condemning them to secular damnation.
Right, and that secular damnation is fundamentally excluded from the state and civil society. So it is Tawney prior to Tawney.
Yeah, well, ironically, it is almost exactly the position that the peasantry are aristocratic countries, and he's seen this, and he describes it, with such intensity that you realize it's just like the oppression of blacks in this country. I saw the film Free Guy, which I never expected to see. I think I saw it on a plane, but about a guy who is a non-playable character in a video game and discovers that he is in a video game. And these NPCs, NPCs, have no existence except as sort of they do things for the plot of the game, and you can slaughter them with impunity, and the idea of they have no control, they have no will of their own, and in a sense, that's the system that that Jefferson sort of brings back into the American culture, because over the course of the 1760s, 1770s, there's this revolutionary fervor, which culminates in his famous line, "All men are created equal." And when he writes that, he means it. There's strong evidence, there's, I think, conclusive evidence that when he writes all men, he absolutely is including blacks. In a sense, he hasn't really made that, that division. He hasn't turned blacks into NPCs yet. But I think it's a sort of horrifying conclusion to come to, but I think that's accurate.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it all comes back to the fact that they suddenly realized that they had this problem of slavery that they couldn't give up. It was almost addictive personality problem, where they couldn't give it up, but at the same time, they couldn't justify it with the enlightenment of the day, so they had to obviously do what Jefferson did and what we've seen through history now. But I think that's a great place to end, because I think we could continue for hours on this.
Undoubtedly.
Yeah, thank you for your work. And is there anything you would like to leave us with about the notes or Jefferson or your own work?
Yes, this is all a very somber discussion of notes, and I have to say that it's an incredible cornucopia of information on all kinds of things, which has been largely inaccessible to the modern reader. This is not this kind of natural history is not to the modern's taste. But I think with my annotations, I have sort of made the parts that are sort of distant from us make sense. And I want to assure listeners that there's a lot of great fun to be had in this book, and whatever your passion is, there's probably a chapter about it in Notes on the State of Virginia. So it's not all dark.